Maria Marten was born in 1801 in the small agricultural village of Polstead, located in Suffolk, eastern England. At the beginning of the 19th century, Polstead was a tightly knit rural community where most families relied on farming, seasonal labor, and local trades to survive. Life followed predictable rhythms shaped by planting seasons, harvests, church attendance, and long-standing social hierarchies. In such a place, personal reputation carried enormous weight, and private matters rarely remained private for long. Maria grew up in modest circumstances. Her father, Timothy Marten, worked as a mole catcher and occasional laborer, a profession that provided little financial security. Her mother died when Maria was young, and Timothy later remarried, bringing Anne Marten into the household as Maria's stepmother. From an early age, Maria contributed to the household through domestic work and employment outside the home, a common expectation for young women of her class. By her late teens, she was working as a servant in nearby homes, moving between households as opportunities arose. Descriptions of Maria from the period portray her as attractive and sociable, qualities that both benefited and burdened her. In early 19th century England, women were judged harshly for any deviation from accepted moral standards, and Maria's personal life attracted gossip. She became involved in relationships that resulted in pregnancies outside of marriage, a fact that marked her socially and limited her prospects. These experiences placed her in a precarious position, dependent on the promises and goodwill of men who often held greater power than she did. One of those men was William Corder, the son of a local farmer. Corder was known in Polstead as well-dressed, confident, and outwardly respectable. He had spent time away from the village and returned with an air of sophistication that distinguished him from other young men in the area. Beneath this surface, however, he had a reputation for deceit and questionable behavior, including previous legal trouble related to fraud. Despite this, or perhaps because of his charm, he formed a relationship with Maria that quickly became intense and secretive. By 1827, Maria believed that William intended to marry her. Marriage represented more than romance. It was a path to legitimacy, stability, and social rehabilitation. According to accounts from her family, William promised Maria that they would leave Polstead together and begin a new life elsewhere. The secrecy surrounding their plans was explained as a necessity to avoid local gossip and interference. Maria's trust in these promises would shape her final decisions. In early May of 1827, Maria informed her stepmother that she was preparing to leave Polstead. She explained that William had arranged for them to meet at the Red Barn, a large agricultural structure located on the outskirts of the village. From there, she claimed, they would travel together to Ipswich, where they would be married. To avoid recognition during their departure, William allegedly instructed her to disguise herself in men's clothing. This detail, while unusual, did not immediately raise alarm, as secrecy was often employed in elopements at the time. On the morning of May 18, 1827, Maria dressed as instructed and left her family home. She told her stepmother she would write once settled. That morning marked the last confirmed sighting of Maria Marten alive. When she did not return by evening, her absence was not immediately considered alarming. The family believed she had begun her journey as planned. Weeks passed without any word. Eventually, letters arrived addressed to Maria's family, signed with her name. In these letters, she claimed that circumstances had changed. Marriage had been delayed. She was living comfortably, though details about her location were vague and inconsistent. Some letters suggested she was in Ipswich. Others hinted at different towns. The tone fluctuated between reassurance and evasion. At first, Timothy and Anne Marten accepted the letters at face value, relieved that Maria was at least alive. Over time, however, doubts began to surface. The letters lacked specificity and were often oddly phrased. Maria never mentioned landmarks, acquaintances, or precise addresses. Requests for visits were ignored or postponed indefinitely. Anne Marten grew increasingly uneasy, sensing that something was wrong. She later reported that Maria's handwriting seemed inconsistent and that the explanations offered did not align with what her stepdaughter would normally say. As months passed, William Corder's behavior attracted attention. He had left Polstead shortly after Maria's departure and was known to be living in London under an assumed identity. When questioned casually by villagers about Maria's whereabouts, his answers were evasive. He claimed that she was well and that circumstances prevented her return. Despite these explanations, suspicion lingered, though no one could articulate a clear accusation without evidence. By late 1827, Anne Marten began experiencing recurring dreams that deeply disturbed her. In these dreams, she saw Maria buried beneath the floor of the Red Barn. The dreams were vivid, repeating with unsettling consistency. While modern interpretations might dismiss such experiences, in the early 19th century dreams were often regarded as meaningful, especially when combined with unexplained circumstances. Anne became convinced that Maria had never left Polstead and that her body lay concealed at the barn. Anne urged Timothy to investigate, but he initially resisted. The idea of digging in the barn based on dreams seemed irrational, and the emotional cost of confronting such a possibility was overwhelming. Still, as the dreams continued and anxiety mounted, Timothy agreed to search the barn. He enlisted the help of a neighbor, and together they went to the Red Barn with tools to examine the ground beneath its floor. What they uncovered confirmed Anne's fears. Beneath the wooden boards lay the remains of Maria Marten, buried in a shallow grave. The discovery ended months of uncertainty and transformed a village mystery into a criminal investigation. Authorities were notified immediately, and the site was secured. News of the discovery spread rapidly through Polstead and into surrounding towns, drawing attention from regional and national newspapers. From this moment forward, the focus of the case shifted decisively. The question was no longer whether Maria Marten had vanished voluntarily, but who was responsible for her death. Suspicion turned immediately toward William Corder, the last known person to see her and the architect of the meeting at the Red Barn. His absence from the village and use of an alias in London only deepened concern. The discovery beneath the Red Barn marked the end of speculation and the beginning of formal proceedings. What followed would become one of the most famous criminal cases in British history, capturing public attention through its investigation, trial, and lasting cultural impact. The discovery beneath the Red Barn floor in late 1827 transformed a local mystery into a matter of national concern. Once the remains were uncovered, local authorities in Suffolk were notified without delay. The barn was sealed off, and officials began documenting the scene according to the standards of the time. Though forensic science was still in its infancy, the discovery itself carried undeniable weight. Maria Marten had not left Polstead to begin a new life. She had never traveled to Ipswich. She had died within the boundaries of the village she had tried to escape. Medical examination confirmed that the remains were those of a young woman consistent with Maria's age and stature. The clothing found with the body matched descriptions given by her family. Though precise determination of cause and timing was limited by contemporary methods, it was clear that her death had not been accidental. The fact that her body had been buried beneath the barn floor strongly suggested deliberate concealment. News of the discovery spread rapidly beyond Polstead. Newspapers across England seized upon the story, drawn by its dramatic elements: a rural village, a vanished young woman, a burial beneath a familiar structure, and the haunting role of a stepmother's recurring dreams. Public fascination grew almost immediately. Reports varied in accuracy, often blending verified facts with speculation. But one name appeared consistently at the center of suspicion: William Corder. Corder had left Polstead shortly after Maria's disappearance and was known to be living in London. Authorities issued instructions to locate and apprehend him. By this time, he had established himself under an assumed name and was presenting himself as a respectable tradesman. When officers finally found him, he offered no resistance. He was taken into custody and transported back to Suffolk to face questioning. During initial interviews, Corder denied responsibility for Maria's death. He acknowledged meeting her at the Red Barn, but claimed that she had left him afterward. His explanations shifted subtly under questioning, raising further doubts. Investigators examined the letters sent to Maria's family in the months following her disappearance. Handwriting comparisons, though rudimentary, suggested inconsistencies that cast doubt on their authenticity. It became increasingly likely that the letters had been written not by Maria, but by someone attempting to delay discovery of her fate. As the investigation progressed, public opinion hardened against Corder. His absence from Polstead, his use of an alias, and his conflicting statements contributed to a growing belief in his guilt. The case became a subject of widespread discussion, not only in newspapers but in taverns, markets, and drawing rooms. Ballads recounting Maria's story circulated widely, often portraying her as an innocent victim betrayed by a deceitful suitor. Formal charges were brought against William Corder for the murder of Maria Marten. He was committed to stand trial at the next assizes in Bury St. Edmunds, scheduled for August 1828. Preparations for the trial drew intense attention. Crowds gathered whenever Corder was moved, and the local infrastructure struggled to accommodate the influx of spectators and journalists. When the trial opened, the courtroom was filled beyond capacity. Observers included local residents, members of the press, and individuals who had traveled considerable distances to witness proceedings. The atmosphere was charged, combining solemn legal procedure with the unmistakable air of spectacle that surrounded notorious criminal cases of the era. The prosecution outlined a narrative built largely on circumstantial evidence. They argued that Corder had lured Maria to the Red Barn under false pretenses, killed her there, and then concealed her body beneath the floor. They presented testimony regarding Maria's departure, the letters sent afterward, and Corder's behavior following her disappearance. Witnesses described his movements, his statements, and his apparent attempts to mislead Maria's family. Particular attention was paid to the letters attributed to Maria. Witnesses testified that the handwriting did not consistently match samples known to be hers. The content of the letters was vague and evasive, offering reassurances without substance. The prosecution argued that these letters demonstrated intent to deceive and prolong uncertainty, allowing Corder time to distance himself from the crime. The defense countered by emphasizing the lack of direct evidence. No one had witnessed Maria's death. No reliable method existed to establish exactly when or how she had died. Corder's legal representatives argued that suspicion and public outrage had filled gaps where proof was lacking. They suggested alternative explanations for Maria's fate, including the possibility that someone else had been involved after her meeting with Corder. Despite these arguments, the cumulative effect of the evidence weighed heavily. The location of the remains, the secrecy surrounding the meeting at the Red Barn, and Corder's actions afterward formed a pattern that jurors found difficult to ignore. The trial unfolded over several days, each session drawing eager crowds and extensive press coverage. Public interest in the case intensified as testimony progressed. Newspapers published daily summaries, often embellishing details to maintain reader engagement. The trial became not merely a legal proceeding but a cultural event, reinforcing narratives about morality, trust, and betrayal in rural England. Maria Marten's story resonated deeply in a society where women's vulnerability and dependence on male promises were widely understood but rarely acknowledged openly. As closing arguments approached, the prosecution framed the case as one of calculated deception and deliberate wrongdoing. The defense urged jurors to resist emotional influence and consider the absence of conclusive proof. Ultimately, the responsibility for judgment rested with 12 men tasked with weighing evidence within the constraints of early 19th century justice. After deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. The decision was met with approval from many observers who believed that justice had been served. William Corder was sentenced to death, the prescribed punishment for murder under English law at the time. The verdict marked the legal conclusion of the trial, but not the end of the story's impact. Public reaction continued long after the courtroom emptied. The Red Barn murder entered popular memory, retold in songs, pamphlets, and stage productions. Corder's fate and Maria's story became inseparable, symbols of a crime that captured the anxieties and fascinations of an entire era. Following the guilty verdict delivered at Bury St. Edmunds in August 1828, William Corder was formally sentenced to death. Under English law at the time, murder carried a mandatory capital sentence, and the court wasted little time in setting an execution date. The decision brought a sense of finality to the legal process, but it did not quiet public interest. On the contrary, fascination with the Red Barn murder only intensified. Corder was transferred to the county jail to await execution. During this period, he became the subject of intense scrutiny. Visitors sought access to him, either out of curiosity or in hopes of hearing a confession. Clergymen visited regularly, urging him to reflect upon his actions and prepare himself spiritually. Accounts from the time describe Corder as composed and articulate, maintaining his innocence in some moments while offering partial acknowledgments in others. His statements during imprisonment were inconsistent, adding further complexity to public interpretation of his guilt. Newspapers followed every development closely. Reports detailed Corder's behavior, his conversations with clergy, and even his demeanor during daily routines. The case had transcended its original circumstances, becoming a national fixation. Printed ballads recounting Maria Marten's fate circulated widely, often portraying her as a symbol of innocence betrayed. The Red Barn itself became an object of grim fascination, drawing visitors who wished to see the place where the crime had occurred. On the morning of August 11, 1828, William Corder was executed. The event drew a large crowd, as public executions were common and often treated as public spectacles during this period. Though modern sensibilities may find this disturbing, such gatherings were considered part of the justice system's deterrent function at the time. Following his execution, Corder's body was examined according to customary practices, and parts of his remains were later used for medical study, a common outcome for executed criminals in the early 19th century. The conclusion of Corder's life did not mark the end of the Red Barn murder's influence. Almost immediately, debates emerged regarding the fairness of the trial and the reliability of the evidence. While many believed the verdict was justified, others questioned whether circumstantial evidence and public pressure had played too great a role. The reliance on letters of disputed authorship, the absence of eyewitness testimony, and the emotional power of the discovery itself all became points of discussion. Maria Marten's family faced their own aftermath. Her father and stepmother were left to process both grief and unwanted notoriety. Anne Marten's dreams, which had led to the discovery of the body, became a focal point of popular retellings. Some accounts emphasized them as a divine intervention, while others treated them as coincidence amplified by hindsight. Regardless of interpretation, the dreams added a supernatural dimension to the case that captured public imagination. In the years that followed, the Red Barn murder became one of the most retold criminal cases in British history. It inspired plays, novels, pamphlets, and later scholarly analysis. The story was frequently altered to suit the needs of entertainment, sometimes exaggerating elements or introducing fictional details. These adaptations ensured the case remained alive in public memory, even as factual accuracy sometimes suffered. Legal scholars later examined the case as an example of early 19th century criminal justice. At the time, investigative tools were limited. There were no standardized forensic techniques, no reliable methods for determining time of death, and no systematic approach to preserving evidence. Verdicts often rested on patterns of behavior and character assessments as much as physical proof. In this context, the conviction of William Corder reflected both the strengths and weaknesses of the system. Maria Marten's role in the story evolved over time. Initially remembered primarily as a victim, she later came to represent broader themes of vulnerability faced by women of her class. Her reliance on promises of marriage and escape highlighted the limited options available to young women seeking respectability and security. The secrecy surrounding her final meeting with Corder underscored the risks inherent in navigating social expectations without institutional protection. The Red Barn itself did not remain standing indefinitely. Over time, it was dismantled, and pieces were reportedly sold as souvenirs. This physical erasure contrasted with the story's persistence in cultural memory. Even as the structure vanished, its symbolic significance endured, representing betrayal, secrecy, and the consequences of trust misplaced. By the mid-19th century, the case was firmly established as a reference point in discussions of crime and punishment. It was cited in debates about evidentiary standards and the influence of public sentiment on jury decisions. Though no formal appeals process existed to revisit the verdict, the questions raised by historians and legal thinkers ensured the case continued to be examined long after those directly involved had passed away. In retrospect, the Red Barn murder illustrates the intersection of individual actions and systemic limitations. William Corder's guilt, while widely accepted, was established through a process shaped by the norms and constraints of its time. Maria Marten's death exposed vulnerabilities in both personal relationships and legal protections. Together, their stories formed a narrative that resonated far beyond a single village in Suffolk. As decades passed, the case remained embedded in British consciousness. It appeared in collections of famous crimes, academic studies, and cultural works that sought to understand why certain stories endure. The Red Barn murder persisted not merely because of its dramatic elements, but because it raised enduring questions about truth, justice, and memory. In the years following William Corder's execution, the Red Barn murder settled into a strange position within British history, no longer an active legal case, yet far from forgotten. Unlike many crimes of the early 19th century that faded quickly from public consciousness, this one endured, preserved through repetition, reinterpretation, and debate. Its survival owed much to the way it intersected with broader social anxieties of the time: fear of deception, concern over moral behavior, and unease about the limits of justice. Almost immediately after the trial, the case became a subject of popular culture. Printed pamphlets retelling the story were sold widely, often emphasizing dramatic elements and moral lessons. Ballads recounting Maria Marten's fate circulated throughout England, sung in public houses and marketplaces. Stage plays dramatizing the events appeared within months of the execution, some drawing large audiences despite official discomfort with turning recent tragedy into entertainment. These adaptations frequently altered details for effect, reinforcing certain narratives while obscuring others. At the center of many retellings stood Anne Marten's dreams. Over time, these dreams were elevated from personal experience to symbolic device. Some accounts portrayed them as divine intervention, suggesting that justice itself had guided the discovery of Maria's remains. Others treated them more skeptically, noting that growing suspicion and anxiety could have shaped Anne's subconscious fears. Regardless of interpretation, the dreams became inseparable from the case's identity, blurring the line between rational investigation and belief. Historians later returned to the Red Barn murder with more critical distance, examining court transcripts, newspaper accounts, and surviving records. They noted how heavily the prosecution relied on circumstantial evidence, while the discovery of Maria's body beneath the barn floor was undeniable. Many aspects of the narrative rested on inference rather than direct proof. The authorship of the letters attributed to Maria, the precise sequence of events on the day she disappeared, and the absence of eyewitness testimony all left room for interpretation. This ambiguity has fueled ongoing debate. Some scholars argue that the totality of evidence against William Corder was compelling when considered together. Others suggest that public outrage, combined with limited investigative tools, may have narrowed the scope of inquiry prematurely. The speed with which the jury reached its verdict, while not unusual for the era, has been cited as an example of how emotional weight could influence legal outcomes. The case also offers insight into the treatment of women within early 19th century society. Maria Marten's vulnerability was shaped by her social position, limited economic independence, and reliance on promises of marriage for security. Her story reflects a broader pattern in which women bore disproportionate risk when navigating relationships constrained by rigid moral expectations. In death, Maria became a symbol of innocence lost, but during her life she experienced judgment and marginalization that narrowed her options. From a legal perspective, the Red Barn murder illustrates the evolution of criminal justice. At the time of the trial, forensic science was rudimentary, policing was decentralized, and standards of evidence differed significantly from those applied today. Confessions, character assessments, and behavioral assumptions carried substantial weight. The case has since been referenced in discussions about the dangers of over-reliance on narrative coherence in the absence of definitive proof. The physical site of the crime did not survive intact. The Red Barn was eventually dismantled and pieces were reportedly sold as curiosities. This removal erased a tangible reminder of the events, yet the story itself proved resistant to disappearance. Even without the structure, the name Red Barn retained its power, evoking secrecy, betrayal, and the hidden consequences of trust. Over time, Maria Marten's identity became inseparable from the crime that claimed her life. Her name appeared in collections of notable criminal cases, academic works on Victorian crime, and discussions of folklore. In some retellings, she was romanticized. In others, she was reduced to a cautionary figure. Rarely was her full humanity explored beyond the circumstances of her death. Modern scholarship has sought to correct this imbalance, emphasizing her life as well as her loss. William Corder's legacy is equally complex. In popular memory, he is often depicted as an archetypal villain, a figure whose guilt is assumed without question. Yet the persistence of debate surrounding his conviction suggests that certainty remains elusive. The absence of new evidence means that reassessment relies on interpretation rather than revelation. As with many historical cases, the truth may never be fully known. What endures most powerfully is the way the Red Barn murder reflects its era. It reveals a justice system striving to impose order with limited tools, a public eager for moral resolution, and a media environment that amplified emotion alongside information. The case demonstrates how stories are shaped not only by facts, but by the needs and fears of those who tell them. Today, nearly 2 centuries later, the Red Barn murder continues to invite reflection. It challenges audiences to consider how justice is constructed, how memory transforms events, and how easily certainty can be mistaken for truth. Maria Marten's story reminds us that behind every famous case lies a human life, shaped by circumstance and constrained by its time. The legal docket closed in 1828 with William Corder's execution. The cultural docket, however, remains open. Each retelling adds another layer, another interpretation, another attempt to understand what happened in a Suffolk barn in 1827. What can be said with certainty is that Maria Marten did not disappear into obscurity. Her name, her story, and the questions surrounding them endure, preserved in history not as spectacle alone, but as a lens through which to examine justice itself.